is the last meeting for this year. We'll be starting again in January. And we look forward to everybody coming. And today we have Howard Balgley. He's going to be speaking. Howard was born in the Bronx, New York. And he attended and graduated from the City College of New York. He got a BA degree. And he also graduated from the New York Institute for Optics, and he became an optician. And he served in the Army in Europe, and he worked as an optician in the Army, which is a good job.
That's a good job.
When he got out of the Army, he met Paula, and he joined her father's printing business, and he was in a printing business in New York City for many, many years. Without further delay, Howard.
Thank you. Applause is not necessary. I'm glad. I can't believe the turnout. My goodness, there's such a big turnout.
Don't disappoint us.
I'll try not to. I did a lot of research on this thing, as well as reviewing some books that I had read before. And one of the things I came up with was, the topic is Israel, which is what I'm going to talk about, and how it thwarted the secret spies that were put up against them by both many of the Western nations. And this is something we didn't fully realize. And the other thing I discovered was the number of our presidents who became involved in the success of Israel. And some of them were plus, and some of them were minus. And minus means they really were not helpful. They were negative people. And what can I say? I can only tell you what the book says. And I only did 2 books. There are about 10 or 12 books on the subject. And can everyone hear me, by the way? I talk very loud, but the mic is supposed to enhance it.
Yeah,
yes.
Everybody can hear you.
Okay. One of the amazing things that I discovered was that the first president who was involved with Israel was Harry Truman. In case you never saw his picture, that's what he looked like. He was a very handsome man, and he considered himself not fully involved in the presidency because he hadn't been elected. He had gotten to be president of the United States as a result of the demise of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who also was not too happy about the Israelis doing what they did. And one of the things you discover is that the Israelis were anxious to take over the land of Israel, which is Palestine, and it had another name. It was the land of milk and honey. But little did we all know that in the overall concept of the land, it was flowing with a 3-letter word, O-I-L. And that caused the big problems in that part of the world, and it's still going on. The United States has somehow or another thwarted it because we're now producing most of the world's surplus oil. But prior to that, most of the surplus oil came from Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia, I'm just giving you a little background, because I got nothing but time. In 1945, our president at that time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was a former Navy man, and he liked to be on a cruiser because of the speed and comforts that they provided him on the ship. He was always flying, going with the cruiser Quincy. And he decided in the midst of returning to America that he would return to the Middle East first because of the problems of oil. And while he was there, he met with the present leader of Saudi Arabia's grandfather rather, excuse me. And they had a conference on board the ship. These people, the Saudis, bring their own food. They brought sheep on board the Quincy, and they slaughtered the sheep on board the ship. So he had the equivalent of an Arab kosher meal. That's what they did. They wouldn't go deviate too much from their diets. And while he was there, he made a deal with Roosevelt that Roosevelt would support the Saudis. What was also there is the British had just been told by the UN that they would have to leave the Middle East. And they were given about 6 to 8 months time to do this. And the UN was going to set up a situation where the UN would have a trusteeship in that part of the world, and in the present Palestine, and that's what it came about in 1946, 47. And in case you all have forgotten, that was what we were up against when we were children. For instance, at this time, the Israelis were planning with their secret services, they were going to bring arms into Palestine. Yeah. I was 16 years old at the time, and living in the Bronx. I went to shul once in a while. I went to synagogue once in a while, and but I was not involved very much with my religion. And one day we were asked to go down to the Brooklyn area of where the ships go out. I don't want to call it, it's
Navy Yard.
not the Navy Yard.
The Narrows.
It's the Narrows, and foreign ships come in there and they're loaded. And I was asked to go there and volunteer my services, starker. That means you gotta have strength to pick things up. And they were loading ammo on board these ships, earmarked for the Irgun, and for the Irgun is a secret organization that existed in Israel at that time. And so I went with the boys. We went down. They brought us coffee and cookies, and you like coffee and cookies. And so we went down there. Sure enough, they had boxes of ammo there and small arms, but nothing big. And we loaded them onto what do you call those things that are lifted up? Forklifts. Thank you very much. And they schlepped them in and put them on board the ships. And we did that for half a day, and they made sandwiches for us, and we went home. And this was secretly done. We were told not to speak about this to anybody. This was done, and I volunteered. I did this one more time, and my mother objected to me doing this. She says, this might be dangerous, stuff might blow up, because she remembers the very famous explosion that took place in New Jersey in 1917, where thousands of people were killed when some ammo blew up. So that was the end of my involvement with that thing in America. And meanwhile, the various important people in the Irgun and in the Zionist movement were anxious to break away from what the UN wanted. The UN wanted to amalgamate both of the factions into one large organization, or whatever, I'm using a wrong word, a nation.
They want to partition Palestine.
Yeah, it was a partition, but they didn't want to partition. Partition was going to take place, taken away from the British, but they were going to form an organization. And the Israelis, the Zionists, shouldn't call them Israelis, they weren't Israelis then. the Zionists were very anxious to create this organization. And that's about where we are at this point. And they wanted to, has anyone got any objections to what I've said so far? I have to stop periodically because sometimes I make boo-boos in my presentations. Harry Truman was in favor. He was the President of the United States at the time, and he was the, he was not the elected president. He was the elected vice president. When Roosevelt passed away, he became president. And he was very much in favor of the Jews doing the separate nation. He didn't like the oil people too much. And who were the oil people? They were Standard Oil of New Jersey. They were in my civilian life, to give you an idea, is I did business with several airlines. And one of them was the Icelandic Airlines. And by doing business with them, printing for them, I discovered that the state of Iceland also needed printing. They didn't have enough facilities there, so I sucked around and got some jobs from them, and I got to be very friendly with them. And I discovered by being close to them that they told me that there was oil being dispersed in northern Iceland during the war by a certain company, Standard Oil of New Jersey, at that time led by our good leader, Nelson Rockefeller. And they were selling oil for use by the Nazi subs. And we didn't really know this because it was in northern Iceland, and we had Marines in Iceland, but they weren't all over the place. And the German subs used to come in at night and load up with fuel, and they didn't have to return to Germany to get more fuel. And this was not done.
I never heard of that.
I know you never heard. I was there.
You were there?
I was there.
Okay.
And the guy bragged to me that the German subs used to come in. On top of that, Rockefeller's Standard Oil New Jersey ships, oil ships, used to stop in the middle of the ocean and load up these German subs with oil, and the Germans paid Standard Oil of New Jersey a tremendous amount of geld.
That was before we went into the war.
During the war.
During the war?
During the war. Rockefeller, I'll tell you the story later. Rockefeller was a trader, and he only was interested in one thing.
Well, we had plenty of it.
When you get to this stage in your life, you never have enough. And that's what the Standard Oil of New Jersey did. And you want me to jump ahead to tell you the story, the Rockefeller story, I can do that.
No. Finish the-
It's another lecture.
finish-
No, I don't want to. I'm not. If I don't get everything done today, I had enough. Yes, sir.
I just want to say that Standard Oil
Of New Jersey.
of New Jersey was getting oil from South America and shipping it to Spain. And
True.
when it was moved
True,
to
that I will
Germany-
tell you later. I will tell you that later.
Oh,
It
okay.
comes out later in the revelation of what happened between Ben Gurion and Nelson Rockefeller. There's so much gossip and stories here. You can't. Yes, sir.
Howard, finish.
Okay. So meanwhile, I'll go into the book here. The State Department was anti-Israel during Truman's time.
Yeah, it always was.
Not quite. It wasn't that way later on.
No, later on.
You want to sit up here, Erwin? I'm using it in sequence. Am I saying right, Bob?
Yeah, just stay on Israel.
That's what I'm going to do.
Okay,
Howard, finish.
I never left.
now you're talking about, okay.
While reading this thing, we discovered that Harry Truman had a friend back home It was a partner, and he was a partner in a haberdashery store with a fellow by the name of Eddie Jacobson, who was Jewish.
Yes.
While Harry's wife wouldn't allow Eddie to come into the house. She wouldn't let any Jew to come into the house. They were anti-black, anti-Jewish, you name it. That's that part of the United States. They never grew up. They were still part of the Civil War. Anyhow, to get into the story. The British senior officers at the State Department favored a United Nations trusteeship over Palestine until the contention between Arabs and Jews could somehow or another be resolved. I'm going to throw names at you. I don't know if you're going to remember some of these names. Like George Kennan.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, some of you guys might remember. These are the people. For instance, there's a statement here by Winston Churchill in 1944 at an international meeting. He got up and screamed, "I am a Zionist." He bellowed at the meeting in Cairo in 1944. Of course, the Attlee government, Winston Churchill was not part of the government at that time. He was, and the Attlee government was in favor of the Arabs. Why were they in favor of the Arabs? The three-letter word, oil. Oil was everything. You know, how many times we go to a gas station and look at the price of gasoline? It's $2.25 today. It's $2.40. It's $2.20. You know, you never. One time when I was a kid, it was 10 cents a gallon. We never paid attention to it. But it has fluctuated enormously even today. Harry Truman was a carelessly pro-Zionist person. And there's nothing I can say except that he was a good guy for the Jews at that period of time. And the head of the Office of Near Eastern Affairs, Lloyd W. Henderson. How many of you guys remember that name? He was a big shot in the State Department, a suave, knowledgeable career diplomat with a strong sense of duty, who was worried about the consequences of the Marshall Plan. What was the Marshall Plan? The Marshall Plan was America's attempt to resurrect, if we've been watching some of these stories on television right now, how devastated Western Europe was. The Marshall Plan created the impetus to change all that around. It fed the hungry, it brought in industry, and it helped Western Europe to survive.
Gave them hundreds of millions of dollars every year.
Henderson from the State Department was worried about the consequences to the Marshall Plan should Arab oil be cut off. Europe being completely dependent on the Arab states at this particular moment. He stressed to Marshall it could be disastrous to the long-range interests of the United States. Well, Marshall took a position against Harry Truman at that time that he was in favor of the Arab states doing what they wanted to do during this situation. Relationships between the State Department and such members, I got an awful lot to talk about, so be patient. Relationships between the State Department and such members of Truman's staff as Clifford and Niles grew extremely difficult. Clifford and Niles were in favor of Israel. Some White House men, some believed that a number of positions taken by career men at the State Department in this matter were based on anti-Semitism, not diplomacy. Jonathan Daniels you heard that name before?
Yep.
Okay, I did. Was to write naming no names. There are men in the State Department who believe that some of the presidential staff were clearly more concerned about Israel in terms of American politics than in terms of American security. George Marshall was deeply concerned about American security, and he was very much afraid that there might be a war, because he was a military man and he understood the possibilities of what could happen in that part of the world if you needed American troops. The British had 50,000 troops in Palestine, 50,000. And George Marshall informed the President of the United States to replace these 50,000 troops with a proper military consideration. We would need 100,000 men. And of course, there was no draft at this time. Dean Rusk, who was George Marshall's assistant secretary in charge of UN affairs, the real cause of difficulty was not any deviousness on the part of the State Department, but the conflicting objectives in the president's own mind. The president was anxious for Israel to become an Israel, and the State Department was against it. In Palestine, during this whole time, violence and terrorism continued. This was 1946. On both sides, the Irgun was very strong, and they had a lot of weapons, and these weapons came from a source not from the United States. The United States had put a embargo, and they could not ship anything to Israel at this time. Wait till I tell you later what really happened within the Six-Day War, if we reach it. It was late in 1947, on Saturday, November 29th, over the Thanksgiving weekend, that the United Nations, at the end of a dramatic 2.5-hour session, voted for partition by a narrow margin. The United States taking a lead part behind these scenes and to see the measure through. Clifford Daniels and Jonathan Daniels, Clifford was not John. Clifford told Jonathan Daniels it was because the White House was for it that it went through. Guess who also was for this? Hello?
Russia.
The Soviet Union.
Yes, right.
The Soviet Union was on the side of Israel at this time.
The United States, they were on the side of the United States.
I'm sorry, Irwin, you must contain yourself. I know it's exciting, but you must contain yourself. One of the reasons is that the Soviet Union was anxious to do this in support of Israel. They were anxious to get control of the three-letter word.
Boy,
And that's the basis of this entire lecture and this whole situation. Eddie Jacobson, if you heard that name before, I mentioned it, was Harry Truman's friend. And this was mentioned in the book that he recorded in a telegraph to Harry in his own chronicle of the unfolding drama. November 6th, President still going all out for Palestine. November 17th, again to the White House. November 26th, received the call from the White House, everything is okay. Friday, received the call from his secretary, Matt Connolly, if you remember that name. Okay? Not to worry. Mission accomplished. And that's what happened. Truman, Jacobson noted, had told him that he, President of the United States, and he alone was responsible for swinging the votes of several delegations. Zionists everywhere were elated in the lobby outside the General Assembly. Now, where was the General Assembly meeting? How many of you went to the 1939 World's Fair?
in Flushing Meadows.
Right. And what was the New York City building? That was the main building that was survived, and that's where the UN met, in that building.
Yeah.
In case you didn't remember that.
Flushing Meadows.
Let him talk.
It's annoying, yes, it's terrible. They don't stop.
Zionists, Jews everywhere. Jews were not all Zionists. Zionists were all Jews, but not all Jews were Zionists. Everywhere were elated in the lobby outside the General Assembly at Flushing Meadows in what had been the New York City building in the 1939 World's Fair. The Jewish delegation was swept up in the embrace of delegates and visitors from all over but the Arab countries. In the hall itself, while members of the Arab delegation walked out, Zionists in the audience were rejoicing because they had made Harry had made a decision to recognize Israel to become Israel at that moment.
I would fix it.
What's that?
Fix it.
I don't know how to do it.
Turn it up, turn it up.
Okay?
Yeah.
Thank you. Am I reaching everybody? Because I talk loud normally. There were Jews in tears and non-Jews moved by the nobility of the occasion. Nobody who ever lived that moment will ever lose its memory from his heart. Recalled Abba Edom. Everyone remember that name? Okay. Who was then a young liaison officer with the Jewish Agency, the official Zionist organization. To the Zionist organization, the vote was a triumphant vindication of the Zionist dream to make a state in that part of the world, an Israeli state. I'm shuddering a little bit. At this point, expressed particularly appreciation for the part played by both the United States and the Soviet Union. Here said the New York Herald Tribune, a demised newspaper, was one of the few great acts of courageous collective statesmanship which our shattered post-war world has been able to achieve. At a Zionist rally in New York Auditorium on 34th Street, this was a building where many people met. It's a little bit west of Fifth Avenue, on the south side of on the north side of the street. And 20,000 people tried to jam into the auditorium on 34th Street. 20,000 people tried to jam into an auditorium, 3 times the seating capacity of the building. Britain announced the responsibility for Palestine would be turned over to the United Nations in less than 6 months. They would pull their troops out. As they were doing this, they left behind their forts, their military facilities, and gave it to the Arabs, and left behind much ammo and rifles and light armor for the Arabs. And the Jews, or the Zionists, got, as they say in Israel, gunish, nothing, nada. Truman was warned by the chiefs of staff that the military intervention by the United States to protect a new Jewish state would require no less than 100,000 troops. The British were about to withdraw 50,000 troops. Our troops were hard workers. The Arabs, Forrestal told, Forrestal was the other espionage person, anti-Semitic person, hard to believe, but he lingered well into the Nixon period as a Defense Department chairman. Forrestal told Cleveland that Jews would be pushed into the seas. The hard truth, as Forrestal reported to Truman, was that the deployable troops that available then were less than 30,000 U.S. Army troops and about 25,000 U.S. Marines. And that's all for that section till we come down. The Jewish pressure on the White House did not diminish in those days following the partition. Truman would write years later the bitter memories. He was exposed to individuals and groups asking me usually in rather quarrelsome and emotional ways to stop the Arabs, to keep the British from supporting the Arabs, to furnish American soldiers, to do this, that, and other things. And he was constantly being exposed to abuse. I think I can say that I kept the faith in the righteousness of my policy in spite of some of the Jews who harassed us. Hundreds of thousands of postcards. I got one postcard just the other day that sent to Marco and a couple of other senators, which I did, to pull back the money given to the Arabs who were getting paid by being terrorists. They were, I don't know if you know that, America is paying terrorists in that part of the world, if they get killed, paying their families. So we wrote a letter to our congressmen and our senators that control this, to give the money to the people who need it, but not to the terrorists, and not to the mishpucha of the terrorists. Because they've been encouraged to do these terribles, and they're killing American civilians all over the world. Just the other day on 34th Street, on 42nd Street, that car ran down the street, no, on the west side.
Having the bomb, yeah.
In Manhattan.
Right, in Manhattan.
Yeah.
Hundreds of thousands of postcards flooded the White House, mailed nearly all from Jewish interest groups, largely as a result of the efforts of the American Zionist Emergency Council. Have we all heard of Ed Flynn? He was the Democratic chairman in New York State, and he came down from New York to tell the President of the United States that he must either give in on Palestine or expect New York opposition to his renomination in July. This is the other side. Truman's patience was thin, war thin. He refused to make a comment on Palestine. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, the Queen Elizabeth, that's a ship, came to New York Harbor carrying a fellow by the name of Chaim Weizmann. And he was a noted international scientist who developed a particular formula for explosives that helped the British and the Western Allies to beat the Nazis. And he came to New York specifically, he was in his late 70s, to speak with Harry about not to back down from his support of Israel. And Truman closed the door to the little doctor and this to Weizmann, and he wouldn't see him. He didn't want to see him.
Why?
I didn't want any more people bothering me. Remember, he's President of the United States. And if he doesn't want anyone to come to the White House, just ask Trump. He kicked out that black girl the other day. Dirty rat. A secret paper from George Kennan's, have you heard of George Kennan?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Policy planning staff recommended no further support for the partition. A report, that's all George Marshall's development. A report from the new Central Intelligence Agency, at this time the CIA was just being organized, concluded that partition would not work and urged reconsideration. More important to Truman were the views of George Marshall, who at the meeting of the National Security Council on February 12th had said that the United States was playing with fire while having nothing with which to put it out. You know what he meant. Our troops, we had a low military, we had discharged almost our entire army. We had a 20 million man army in 1945 that conquered Europe, and they were all discharged. And my brother was home. Marshall saw America as gravely threatened by the Soviet Union, and as a soldier, he was acutely aware of the vital importance of Middle Eastern OIL in the event of war in Europe, which seemed more likely by that day. Marshall had, beside a soldier's distaste for politics, he was not a politician. Writing about the Palestine question in a letter to Eleanor Roosevelt, in case you didn't know this, She was the grandmother of Kermit Roosevelt, who became very involved in this thing. And here's an interesting sideline. Did you know two people who won the Congressional Medal of Honor twice?
Teddy Roosevelt
And who else?
and it was his son, General Teddy Roosevelt Jr. won the Medal of Honor on D-Day.
Kermit.
What?
Kermit.
Pardon?
Kermit.
Oh,
But who was the other one that won the Congressional Medal of Honor at the same time?
Teddy
MacArthur.
Roosevelt got the medal.
Thank you.
Teddy Roosevelt got the Medal of Honor.
Who was the
For
guy
the
that,
charge of San Juan Hill during the Spanish-American War, 1898.
Was he riding a horse?
No horses.
He rode a horse up San Juan Hill.
No horses up San Juan Hill.
He rode a horse up San Juan
Okay,
Hill.
okay,
who was the second person? We missed it.
It was MacArthur.
MacArthur?
MacArthur won the Medal of Honor twice. He won it first in World War I, and then he won it again from leaving Bataan in,
Oh, what an Ed too.
yeah.
Yeah.
He should have been court-martialed.
Only two people won the CMH twice.
And they were, say it again.
The Marshall, MacArthur, and the Kermit Roosevelt and Theodore Roosevelt. Kermit Roosevelt was Roosevelt's son. He was on D-Day, walking up and down on D-Day, up and down the beach, kicking the American troops who were digging holes and wouldn't climb the hills. And he would kick, he said, if you stay here, you're going to get killed. And he made them go up the hill, and he led them up the hill. He won the CMH for that.
He also died.
Well, he died later.
No, he died.
He didn't die on the beach.
Had a heart attack.
Yeah, he didn't die on the beach.
Yeah, it's supposed to be Israel. Let's go back to Israel.
Let's go back to Israel.
Very well. Clifford grew increasingly concerned. On 5 occasions, I told, I'm running out of time. I think I should accelerate this. On arriving at New York, Chaim Weizmann had taken ill from the strain of events. Every effort to make contact with Truman had failed. Late the night of February 20th, as Weizmann laid in his room at the Waldorf Astoria, no less, the president of the National B'nai B'rith, Frank Goldman, put through a call to who?
Eddie Jacobson.
Thank you. Eddie Jacobson, who was a personal friend of Harry. In Kansas City, getting Jacobson out of bed, 3 hours difference in time. Asked him if he would be willing to help. No one but not even Ed Flynn could budge the president. In a hurried letter to Truman, Jacobson begged him by letter to see Chaim Weizmann as soon as possible. But in response to the letter, from where was he? Key West. Dated February 27th, Truman said there was nothing new that Weizmann could tell him. The situation, Truman added, was not solvable as presently set up. Eddie Jacobson, refused to accept defeat. No sooner had Truman returned to Washington than Jacobson arrived from Kansas City. On Saturday, March 13th, without an appointment, he walked into the White House, the West Wing of the White House, no badge, and went right into Truman's office. Matt Connolly, who was Truman's male secretary, warned him that under no circumstances was he to mention Palestine. Entering Truman's office, shaking hands with his old friend, Jacobson was pleased to see how well he looked. Florida had done good for you, Jacobson told him. For a while they chatted about their families and Jacobson's business, which was haberdashery and a subject which Truman was aware of because he had lost money with Jacobson. Jacobson said always had a brother, Truman had a brother's interest. They were alone in the West Wing, largely unoccupied. The hush of the room was greater than usual. Jacobson brought up Palestine. Truman suddenly, tense and grim-faced, responded in a hard, abrupt fashion, not at all himself, Jacobson thought. In all the years of our friendship, he never talked to me in that fashion. Jacobson remembered Truman told Clark he was not angry at Jacobson so much as the people who were using Jacobson to get to him. Truman said he had no wish to talk about Palestine or the Jews or the Arabs or the British. Truman said he would leave that to the United Nations. He spoke bitterly of the abuse he had been subjected to and how disrespectful and mean certain Jews had been to him. This is not unique to our group. Jacobson thought suddenly and sadly that my dear friend, the President of the United States, was at this moment as being as close to being an anti-Semite as any man could possibly be.
Talk a little louder.
Okay,
Move it down.
okay?
Yeah,
Thank you.
move it down.
On a table to the right was one of the President's prized possessions, a small bronze of Andrew Jackson on horseback. The model of the statue by Charles Keck that Truman had commissioned for the Jackson County Courthouse in Kansas City. Truman was a judge in Kansas City in his previous life. Jacobson had noticed it on other visits, but he pointed to it and he found himself making an impassioned speech. Harry, you're not reading this now. I'm sorry. Am I doing this correct?
Yeah, bring it down.
Harry, all your life you have been a hero. I too have a hero, a man I had never met, who I think is the greatest Jew who ever lived. I am talking about Chaim Weizmann. He's a very sick man, almost broken in health. He traveled thousands of miles just to see you and plead the cause of his people. Now you refuse to see him just because you were insulted by some of our Jewish leaders, even though you know that Weizmann had absolutely nothing to do with these insults, and would be the last man to be a part of them. It doesn't sound like you, Harry. I thought you could take this stuff very well, and they have been handing, even though they've been handing this out. As Abba Eben later wrote, the comparison between Weizmann and Andrew Jackson was unimaginably far-fetched. Go back to the others, because I can't see you. These are trifocals. These are just reading glasses. I can read with this too. Truman began drumming his fingers on the desk. He reeled around in his chair and he told Jacobson, for what Jacobson seemed like centuries, neither of us said anything. And swinging about again, he looked Jacobson in the eye and said, Jacobson later describes it the most endearing words he had ever heard. You win, you bald-headed son of a bitch. I will see Weizmann. From the White House, Jacobson walked directly across Lafayette Square up 16th Street to the bar at Statler. As never before in his life, he downed 2 double bourbons. In the morning pages were filled with rumors of war. Truman was extreme. The Marshall Plan was insufficient to check the Soviet menace. Here we go. At the close of hostilities in World War II, the Soviet and its agents have destroyed independence and democratic character of a whole series of nations in Eastern and Central Europe. That's the East Germans, Romania, Hungary, all over Eastern European stations. In this ruthless action, I believe we have reached a point at which the position of should be made unequivocally clear. There are times in world history when it is far wiser to act than to hesitate. There will be no peace. We must be backed by the strength we must be prepared to pay the price for peace, or assuredly we shall pay the price of war. So spoke Harry Truman. But the Congress was unmoved. Arthur Kroc, ever hear of him? Editor for the New York Times. An acknowledged hardliner, meaning that he was for the Arabs. Truman deserved great praise for his courage, as well as his disregard for political consideration. Frankly, candidly, wrote Richard Stroughton in the New Republic, I think Harry Truman is licked, and we don't think any crisis atmosphere will elect him. He was worried that he wouldn't get selected to be run for president in the 1948 election. It's a very important one because we all know who won that election. We all know who lost. I got a picture in here. Yes, Bob.
Do you have any information concerning the conversation that Weissman had with Truman when Weissman finally got into Truman's office? Is that recorded in any way?
I come to that point.
Yes, you're jumping over the thing.
No, it's
Okay,
the next section, next paragraph.
sure.
Shortly after dark on the evening of March 18th, to avoid being seen by reporters, Chaim Weissman was ushered quietly to the White House by way of the East Wing.
Thank you.
Truman, who had not this came later, who had not informed the State Department what he was up to, insisted the meeting be kept secret. Eddie Jacobson, by now a familiar face to the White House press, had agreed to stay away, but later on they said he was there. According to later accounts by Truman and Weissman, the meeting went well. They talked for 3/4 of an hour. Truman said he wanted to see justice done without bloodshed, and assured Weissman that the United States would support partition. When he left my office, Truman would write, I felt that he had received a full understanding of my policy, and I knew what it was he wanted. Recalling the event years later, he would also remember Eddie Jacobson was present too. Then they mentioned all these various people who supported Truman. Emmanuel Sella. How many of you remember him?
Yes.
Okay.
Congressman.
Yeah,
Congressman.
from New York.
From Brooklyn.
Brooklyn, right.
That's not New York.
No, New York was
Certainly is.
The New York Times accused the administration of unprecedented ineptness and caving into base material concerns, meaning that they recognized Israel. And here's that famous quotation, "The land of milk and honey now flows with oil." The homeland of 3 great religions is having its fate decided by expediency without a sign of the spiritual and ethical considerations which should be determined at least in that part of the world. Ancient Palestine. I could have brought a map of ancient Palestine. Ancient Palestine was once described as not the land of philosophers, but the home of prophets. It would take a prophet sitting on the rapidly spinning turntable to have foreseen. I think I should move ahead because there are 3 more awards. I won't get to all of them.
I haven't got time for 3 more.
It's almost 11. Each one takes 10 years. One took 6 days.
The White House was deluged with letters, telegrams, and petitions to the president filled with alarm and outrage over such whimsical and cynical action. That's the other side. Vacillating and disastrous policies, nor were they all from Jews or Jewish organizations. This change can mean nothing but complete annihilation of that wonderful, home-loving race of people who have demonstrated the wonders that they can accomplish in that country which actually, before God and men, belong to them. For Eddie Jacobson in Kansas City, March 19th, this is still 47,
was Black Friday. People enraged over the news kept calling him all day long. How do you feel now that his friend Truman had turned out to be a traitor? In other words, he backed away at this point from the situation. He found out that the State Department had interfered, had reversed my Palestine policy. Truman wrote in a fury on his calendar, "The first I know about it, I see in the papers, isn't that hell? I am now in a position of being a liar and a double-crosser," to Weizmann. "I never felt so low in all my life." There are people on the third and fourth level of the State Department who have always wanted to cut my throat, and right now they are succeeding in doing it. On Saturday, April 11th, to avoid a few reporters hanging about the White House, Eddie Jacobson slipped through the East Wing. Again, Truman confirmed very strongly, according to Jacobson, what he had told Weizmann that he was going to support the Israelis. He now assured Jacobson he would recognize the new Jewish state. And to this, Jacobson agreed later with his whole heart. Harry Truman, President of the United States, had made up his mind. But he had one more thing to overcome: George Marshall. George Marshall said that if Truman went ahead with this, he would not vote for him in the coming 40-year election. And George Marshall had a huge following in America. Truman just didn't say anything to George Marshall other than to say, "General, he is here because I asked him to be here." Meaning Clifford. Clifford was pro-Truman.
Why don't you take questions?
You got 5 minutes.
You got 5 minutes.
I have 5 minutes. I can't go to the 6-day war.
Just skip to it. Go to
Howard, why don't you
Skip
take
over
questions?
Go to the 6-day
Take
war.
questions.
You got any questions?
Yes.
Yes,
No, go to the 6-day
Then Larry.
war.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, you mentioned oil as a major factor.
There is no
And I saw and have read that a major factor in the voting was post-World War II, the Allies maintained...
Where was the voting?
The
Where was the
voting in the UN.
Makes sense.
That, in other words, the post-World War II, the Allies had maintained the concentration camps full of...
I want to answer your question right away.
Let it rip.
Cyprus.
Secret war against the Jews. The secret war against the Jews was run by the oil policy. And they didn't come out at the UN. They subtly played a very low profile there. But they were there. In case you didn't know this, during the, later on in the,
Make it up, Howard, make it
all
up.
right, okay, I'll make it up. One of the wars was the problem of Nelson Rockefeller. They couldn't get, the Jews couldn't get, by this time they had a state, but they weren't accepted into the UN. They were very anxious to be accepted into the UN as in their own ways. And they needed to get a certain percentage of the states in the UN. Now, who were these states in the UN? There were about 35 states, 40 states in the UN at that time. Presently, there are over 150 states in the UN, but at that time it was only about 30 or 35. And these states voted against them. I can give you the list of the states that voted against them.
No, it's not.
That is.
All right. The point was that Ben Gurion was very anxious to get into, you've ever heard of Ben-Gurion?
Sure.
Ben-Gurion was very anxious to get into the UN. And to get into the UN, he had to receive a majority of the states. The majority of the states, mostly South American, were against it. And if you abstained from it at the time, I can't sing this. And if you abstained from it at the time,
That's a little louder.
you did not get, it was not necessary to vote against it, because they just didn't count the abstentions. And so he discovered that there was one man in the State Department who was against it, who was kicked out of the State Department by Harry Truman, and his name was on, I used to work on 55th Street, and he had a girlfriend on 55th Street. Thank you very much. You must have just been in the bedroom. He died in bed with this girl. The family gave her $125,000 to dress him before they took him out. In case you didn't know this. Anyhow, he confronted Rockefeller with this information that Rockefeller had control over the South American states. Was the South American states, who said before about oil from South America?
Larry.
Oil from South America.
That's on the other side.
Other side.
Other side of the.
Large amounts of oil came from South America, and Standard Oil of New Jersey coveted this oil. And they were under the power of the Rockefeller family, who did not hesitate to ship whenever it was necessary with money. And you know what that means, payoff. And so Ben-Gurion confronted Rockefeller and said that you were helping the Nazis. At that time, Ben-Gurion only knew about the freighters that were giving oil to the Nazi subs. I happen to know about they got it in northern Iceland. But the point was, he says, you are a traitor, and this happened during wartime. And guess what happens when you do this and you're convicted of war of this crime? You get hung or you get shot. And Rockefeller realized what Ben-Gurion was after. He was after the support of Rockefeller to get these various states to vote for Israel to be brought into the UN. And so he said, what do you want to him? And this is a very famous statement. What do you want, vengeance, or do you want a state? Because if you want vengeance, you're not going to get a state. If you want a state, I insist that you hold this information completely secret between us. And Ben-Gurion never revealed this information until after Rockefeller died later on, and he was exonerated by the family. And he overnight got control over Britain, France, all the South American nations, Argentina, Venezuela, the Central American countries. Only one Central American country, Guatemala, was in favor of Israel becoming, was an pro-Israeli country. And every one of them voted for Israel to be a state in the UN. And Rockefeller was defeated indirectly, but Ben-Gurion won his point. I think that's enough. I'll hold the other one for some other time.